Hi, folks. Welcome to this wonderful event. In case you walked in off the street and weren't sure what you were coming for, this event is called The Social Scientific Roots of Bias in Artificial Intelligence and the Limits of the Technical. There's loud noises behind me for reasons that are not totally clear. I'm not... perhaps the Awesome. Good. Perhaps the limits of the technical are emerging in real time. I'm Timothy Wyman McCarty. I am associate professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and I am very excited to welcome my dear friend, the brilliant scholar and historian Kevin Padraic Donnelly from Alvernia University. Kevin received his PhD from Brandeis University. Go Judges, and has published now 2 very wonderful books, Adolphe Quetelet, Social Physics and the Average Men of Science, 1796 to 1874, and most recently, The Descent of Artificial Intelligence, a deep history 400 years in the making. Some of you in this room have read this book either as part of a faculty reading group or in my capstone class, but you're going to hear all about this. And I would also like to make a particular plug for my personal favorite of Dr. Donnelly's publications, which is his 2013 article, How to Make Robot Friends, Mocking Technophobia and Technophilia in Mystery Science Theater 3000. If you're wondering, it is an even more delightful read than it is as a title. So Dr. Donnelly will be being interviewed by our very own Darby Vickers of the Philosophy Department, who is a fan of Mystery Science Theater 3000, but I do not believe has published anything yet in the Mystery Science Theater 3000 universe. So without any further ado, I want to hand it over to Dr. Vickers and Dr. Donnelly, who will wow us with all kinds of wonderful things to say.
Thanks, Tim, for doing that introduction at the last minute. That was wonderful and charming. And thank you so much, Kevin, for coming and talking with us about this wonderful book, which, by the way, has such a beautiful cover. I have just been fascinated by it. So anyway, your book provides a sort of alternative history of AI that is not about the technology, but about the data and the various mathematical models that are used to analyze that data. A bunch of the students here have read at least sections of your book, but I was wondering for anybody who hasn't gotten a chance to read it yet, if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to this project and describe it briefly for those who haven't dived into it yet.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Tim, for lovely introduction, and thank you, Darby, and all the associated groups that kind of set this up. I really appreciate being out here. It's a nice trip. I got here from Philadelphia, stopped in a rain and snowy Detroit, and just got in this morning. So very happy to be here with you all. Yeah, I'm glad you like the art. It's Marcel Duchamp, Nude Descending a Staircase, in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, about 2 blocks away from where I live now, and I used to go see it as a kid, and I almost wanted to write the book so I could get that picture on the front of a book. So I'm glad you like that. The book, as an idea, kind of grew out of some work I had done on the figure that Tim mentioned, Adolphe Quetelet. He was a statistician in the 19th century, and I had done a very narrow, what some might say boring kind of academic thing where I just dive into one small guy and very, very narrowly researched it. But I had all these big ideas that were kind of going along outside of that. And the kind of detritus from the first book is kind of what ended up in here. And so briefly what it is it is not a book about technology. It's not a book about science and technology. It's not a book about, Alan Turing's in there, but it's not about the builders and makers of modern AI. What I kind of came across as I was reading about AI and I was thinking about this longer project was that AI had been based upon trying to meet some sort of goal, the intelligence of a person. But what I realized, and those of you that read the read parts of the book, what I realized very quickly is that the goal that AI is supposed to be aspiring to has never been defined. It's never been articulated. It's always just sort of an implicit idea. And one of the things I came upon was an interview with 50 AI experts. All were asked, when would AI get to, quote, the human level or human intelligence? And what I realized that nobody defined it in the entire book. Nobody defined what human intelligence was. Nobody defined what a person is supposed to be. And, we're here in this humanities center, which is a place where people, have been debating what a person is or what a person should be doing for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And here were all these experts saying, oh, well, maybe we'll capture what it means to be a person in 10 years, maybe in 20 years. And so it seemed to me that we needed a book about how we've defined what AI is supposed to be accomplishing. And so that's what I kind of ended up digging my teeth into about 7 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a fascinating and very timely topic to have picked up 7 years ago, and a sort of perfect time for this to come out. So I'm going to intersperse some questions of my own with questions from students, and I had a student who asked a question that's related to something that I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into. But you start off very early in this text, right? You start off with Descartes and Fontenelle and this sort of like very deep French history of mechanical thinking and geometry, and then you sort of take us up to what is going on with AI in the present day. And so Diego asked, how do the early mechanical interpretations of human thought or the human mind compare to our contemporary methods for developing AI and those statistical methods that you mentioned in that sort of shift?
So it's the big shift in terms of the shift from kind of what was called the mechanical philosophy, and that's what Descartes and Fontenelle were up to, takes place in the 19th century. That's when you start to get what Ian Hacking and others have called the avalanche of data, where we actually have things that we can count. And before, it was kind of a purely mechanical model, but you start to get kind of statistical analysis in the 19th century when people start counting more and more stuff. Adolphe Quetelet, again, the guy who wrote the book on, is kind of the father of statistics, so I kind of knee deep in that world. And that's when you kind of start to see the pivot point. And of course, most of the AI today is impossible without data collection. Early AI models were based upon, if you've ever, it's probably the best visions, like Rocky V, I think, the terrible Rocky, where there's this silly robot that is kind of, I think Sylvester Stallone actually got rid of that robot when he recut it. But there's that clunky kind of robot that we had in the 80s and 90s, and that was going to be the artificial intelligence. And that was very rules-based, mechanical thinking. And that's a little bit more similar to the world of Descartes. What makes modern AI so much different is that it's all predictive and it's all statistics. And so that turn, I guess, wouldn't have been possible without collecting more data. And of course, the internet gave us the greatest data collecting institution possible. So that's kind of how that turn was able to take place.
Yeah, absolutely. And for students in my class, we've talked a lot about the differences between symbolic and sub-symbolic, and you can see that sort of charted in the mechanical would be the sort of analogy to the symbolic AI, which is that GoFi, and then the sort of statistical is the sub-symbolic, where we're doing all of the statistical math around it. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into these sort of questions about mathematics. So in the sort of overarching theme of the book, you talk about the ways that scholars model human beings and human behavior, and we talk about this sort of this geometric and mechanical model in this early part of the book. And from the way that I sort of tend to think about these things, right? These models are sort of based on certainty, but they're also more error tolerant, right? Something that's based on geometry and mechanics in the way that someone like Descartes is looking at it. And yet in the later chapters, the sort of mathematical models that we switch to are based on sort of statistics, which have like less certainty, as you pointed out, but also are like significantly less error tolerant in the way that they capture the world. And I was wondering if these two kinds of models are sort of equally problematic in the way that they simplify humanity, or whether there's some kind of significant difference between the two mathematical ways of analogizing the world and trying to understand humans.
It's an excellent question. One of the things that came up when I was looking at Descartes was there's this big debate about whether he was involved in something called universalis mathematica, which is basically a sense that mathematics is the underlying sort of reality of the world. That math isn't just the way that we kind of get at the world; it just is the world, almost in like a Pythagorean sense. That it's almost mystical in a sense that mathematics actually is structured. And one of the things that statistics kind of pushed away from was no, it was just probabilistic. So you go from a very kind of Newtonian world, which is a very ordered and predictable world where everything's going to happen, and then you get into the world of someone like James Clerk Maxwell, where you have indeterminacy, and then you know that goes obviously into the quantum world. And so, in terms of whether or not they're both dangerous, I think was your initial question. Mm-hmm. I have almost a little bit more tolerance or interest in the kind of mathematics underlying the underlying structure of the world, as opposed to the probabilistic model. But it is, I would say they're equally troubling.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about the way that each of them simplify the human? In particular, my students didn't read the sort of early chapters, so give them a bit of a background on the way that Descartes and those mechanical models simplify what it means to be a person. Oh,
sure. Yeah. So, I mean, if you know what most people know about Descartes, if you know anything about Descartes, is the mind-body division, right? And that's the kind of standard vision is that we are divided into a machine-like body that basically operates as a machine. Descartes was very interested in mechanics itself. He was inspired by pistons, hydraulics, fountains that he saw, and he would essentially just draw models of the human body that were analogous to machines. And then what kind of saves us is that there's supposed to be this kind of disembodied mind, right, which kind of operates. And of course, if you've taken like a Philosophy 101 class, right, you've probably taught this. How does this disembodied mind interact with the mechanical being? And one of the maybe the scary parts about researching was reading Descartes' work, which is known as the Rules, which you tend not to read as an undergraduate or even as a graduate student. But when you start to read that, you realize that he's not really the disembodied or spiritual mind doesn't really exist, and that in the Rules it becomes very clear that the mechanics and the machine analogies that it's just supposed to be to the body seem to be working at the mind level of the mind as well. And one of the things that is known about the time was that Descartes suppressed this work because Galileo had just been arrested and tried and put on house arrest for similar ideas, and so Descartes suppressed all these ideas that the mind itself might be a machine, and you get kind of a softer Descartes. But about 80 years later, they released this part that basically makes the mind seem like a machine, and so that is kind of the most, I guess, reductive possibility, and that this kind of nice floating mind that operates independent of the body doesn't actually exist, and that we're all machine, mind, body, everything.
Yeah. And so tell us then a little bit about I'm going to ask the student question because it flows right in. So one of my students, Ben, asked that you wrote that due to the move toward professional social sciences in fields like sociology, economics, and psychology, one of the three important consequences for the emergence of AI was the introducing a new kind of simplification and reduction, that of a social science researcher himself. Can you further expand on this? And
yeah, it's a great question. I'm very happy you asked that question because what was the name of the student? Ben. I'm happy if Ben's out there. I don't know if you're out there. Oh, thanks, Ben. Yeah, one of the it's a side project. It's kind of going on at the side of the book, is that the social science researcher themselves, or himself or herself, in the 20th century kind of becomes a model for the predictive routine being. And there's all this, if you've read these sections, there's all these attempts to basically define what you need to be in order to be not just a scientist, but a social scientist in particular. You're not allowed to have any moral claims or any moral values. You're not allowed to be motivated by anything other than scientific discovery. You're basically not supposed to think outside of the scientific methodology. And people in sociology and parts of anthropology, but especially psychology and behaviorism, the first, I'm going to use some Foucaultian language here, but it's the first disciplining of the mind takes place amongst these researchers themselves. So the kind of canary in the coal mine for what AI is supposed to look like actually looks like these social scientists who basically can't think morally, can't think with ethical values. I guess that's part of what we're here for. Essentially, you have they're literally being told by people in the field of sociology and psychology that you have to stamp out all of your ethical feelings, all of your moral feelings to be a scientist. And so that's why I think that kind of is a scary proposition if that's what something like AI turns out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so speaking of like sort of drilling down a little bit into the sort of divisions among the social sciences and the social scientists, you pit this sort of positivist social science, which you sort of refer to, I think, in the conclusion as this like 1980s kind of social science, against Tukey's idea of a data detective. And I was wondering, just for anybody who hasn't read it, if you could explain the difference between the two of those approaches. And then I have a follow-up question about the Tukey stuff as well.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because John Tukey, who was a mathematician at Princeton and started the statistics department at Princeton. He worked for Bell Labs. He worked for a number of government organizations. And he had this, what I would say, kind of amazing, expansive vision for what a statistician could be. And for him, it was to be above the mathematician, that the statistician should be the ones asking the questions. And so he pits this difference between statistics as what he calls sanctification, which basically means it's the statistician's job to look at the numbers. If any of you have to run the p-squared test or the SPCC, or you're doing those kind of statistical models, you basically just do all your thinking afterwards, and you just make sure the numbers work out okay. What Tukey wanted statisticians to be was a detective, and he thought that they should be the first ones asking the questions, that it shouldn't be up to, he actually thought statistics should be above mathematics, and he argued for the statistics department to be outside of the mathematics department, and then when he died, they put it back into the mathematics department. But he's kind of one of these, Christopher Willis, who does work for the New York Times and writes a lot about data science, he's brought Tukey back into the public mind. But I think he's an underappreciated intellectual from the Cold War era who had a much broader vision of what statistics could do. Yeah.
And so you say that sort of like Tukey's idea never really materialized, although it's coming back a little bit now. Is the sort of benefit of his kind of position that it's less biased? Would it be more beneficial if it were adopted? Is this a kind of research that AI researchers could pursue to use as a basis?
I do think it could be. And one of the reasons is because Tukey assumes that there's going to be bias in the researcher himself or herself. He says that there should be bias, that they're people, that they're doing thinking work. And when you're doing thinking work, you're going to, in the neutral sense, you're going to discriminate. You're going to make differences. And he thought people should be kind of honest and upfront about that prospect. And so what you get a lot now, of course, is this kind of black box model, which is, well, we don't know why the algorithm's making that decision. We have no idea, and we can't know, essentially, how it's built. And so what Tukey would have asked or wanted was to have people kind of at the very beginning or building of the process. So instead of bringing in, the ethicist or the ad hoc process of sort of evaluating what an AI is doing or not, he would have wanted those people to be in at the very beginning of the process, so that they're not just kind of coming in at the very end.
Yeah, and so, but does that change the way that the data is collected or the way that it's analyzed, or is it just a sort of like approach, something different in approach to the way that other statisticians are doing their work?
So the number one way in which it would kind of change the approach is Tukey was a big believer in outliers. He was a big believer in kind of resampling. So instead of just taking the mean distribution point, or of course, what AI is doing is basically predicting the mean word that would come next in a sequence, he would have allowed for, I think, a much wider or broader vision of what would have come next, rather than just relying kind of on a mountain of data. So what you would end up with essentially is you would have fewer kind of average predictive ideas, and you would end up with kind of a wider panoply of ideas that would come out, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Am I getting to your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just want to sort of like continue following this train for a little bit, because one of the things that a lot of the students asked when I sort of got their pre-questions was about, is there a sort of solution that is being proposed to trying to create some of these less biased systems? Is it possible to sort of totally, to debias statistics in the kind of way that would be necessary?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you're talking about the level of sort of pure solutions to problems of AI bias today, I'm probably talking to a good crowd for this, but it's humanities education through and through, at the beginning of the process, at the middle of the process, at the end of the process. We have an engineering school at my university, and we have these 8-semester plans, and they literally squeeze in all of the general education humanities requirements in the last semester. So the engineering students will come in, take only engineering classes essentially for the first 3 years. And then, of course, I don't know if you're seniors, you're maybe not paying attention your final semester all that much. That's when you get all your kind of general education. So, having engineers trained in humanities from the very beginning, making that a core portion of engineering training. And again, that's why it ties back into these social scientists, because nowhere that I know are engineers really given serious training that they should be scholars of literature, scholars of history. Even if they have to take a philosophy class, it'll be an AI and ethics philosophy class, so that they don't have to actually think about anything outside of their chosen field. Sorry if there's any engineers in here, but the big part of the book that you get in here is that engineering as a how should I put this, as a kind of profession, traditionally has not really allowed a broad base of education, and has not been strongly encouraged to study things like history, literature, philosophy, theology. And I think we would all be much better off if engineers were trained in those things.
Yeah, so actually speaking of that, and once again, a section that at least my students didn't read, you talk about this interesting debate about the introduction of science into the French schooling system.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what the sort of perspectives were and why people believed that scientific education was ruining education?
Yeah, so it was a difficult chapter to write, because the major critics that I talk about, and they're critiquing the French educational system, tend to be these what I would just consider not just conservative, but like knuckle dragging conservatives. And this is France in 1800, so meaning like divorce should be banned, that level of conservatism. The monarchy should be restored, but with a more powerful monarch than Louis XVI, because Louis XVI was too weak of a monarch, and that's why the French Revolution happened. And so these are the people that I'm kind of drawing on. And I'm thinking, I'm reading these kinds of things, and it's kind of abhorrent to my own political sensibilities. And then I'm reading what they have to say about education, and they sound like a Berkeley humanities professor or someone teaching in like Massachusetts who is wearing the corduroy jacket, and they just have such a great belief and faith in teaching things like what you would call belles lettres in French. They just have this sensibility that it really could, and almost in the kind of the liberal arts way, that it can kind of change souls or change minds. And so their critique was that when they saw, this happened mostly with Napoleon. Napoleon actually got rid of humanities from the French Institute, and he wanted basically military and technical training. And there was this thing called the Polytechnique, École Polytechnique, which was basically only about military training and science. And what they saw was, or what they believed was that was kind of killing the French spirit. That there was these, and again, apologies to any engineers in here, but that it was just kind of generation after generation of what they would call kind of dull, uninteresting, technically trained people who had no appreciation for anything else other than what their job told them to do, which again, if you're teaching humanities, is a constant uphill battle today, trying to explain that there might be something of value in a college classroom outside of what you can do to get a paycheck. So I felt I don't want to bring back the end of divorce, or I'm happy. I don't want to go as far as they did politically, but I just found that everything I was hearing in their arguments against science education was similar to what I was hearing today. And since they're French and it's the early 19th century, they provide innumerable quotes that are fun to write and type. So that's essentially their concern, is that, and it does go all the way back to Rousseau. I mean, it goes back to earlier than them, but the idea that science education kind of stifles the spirit.
Yeah, interesting. And so in terms of like thinking about what the lessons that we can draw from that today, obviously without going back to some of those conservative ideals, what would the sort of recommendations that you would draw from that be about reshaping engineering education? Obviously, it's like not leaving the humanities till the end, but are there specific things that are important for the process of getting us to understand what it means to be human in this fuller sense, to doing this kind of technical work?
I'm not sure I quite. Can you ask the question? I'm
Yeah.
not sure in terms of what, outside of what I said earlier about kind of in terms of science, in terms of humanities education, ways of being more fully human.
Parts, right?
Yeah.
About that sort of tell us what it means to be human, because you're like, okay, having an ethics of AI class is like not, because it's still like too, within the discipline that the technical person is working in. What would this sort of more expansive curriculum look like? Is it just a sort of core of humanities classes? Does it mean theoretical and not applied classes? Like, what does it take for us to fill out that picture?
Interesting. Okay, so I've been waiting for the dean of my college to ask me this question of what are, but I mean, it would be what I tend to be, and maybe I kind of romanticize this vision, but the model of kind of staring at 5 or 6 philosophy classes and having to pick 2 for that semester based on what's interesting, whether you've had the professor before, whether you like them, how that fits in your schedule. I kind of like the randomness involved. I mean, I think so much of the scheduling process that takes place is very mechanical in of itself, and there's not much freedom of thought or freedom of choice within the scheduling model. So I would advocate for a lot more kind of serendipity in what you choose, and you might just end up in an animal ethics class or a standard philosophy ethics class or something completely removed. And my vision is that would make you a much better engineer because you'd be different from the other 10 who are all taking the same AI and ethics class. Mm-hmm. So that would be, I think, an answer to your question about just a broader.
Yeah, and it's funny that you talk about scheduling, because one of the early things that Bill Gates was hired to do as a programmer was to write a scheduling program for his school to make sure that they could actually allot classrooms in the right way. So it's just interesting.
We just had a proposal. I thought it was a joke. We were on Zoom and to do our advising using AI next year, to have an AI program so that all advising is done and no need to consult with an advisor or your mentor or anything, and that AI could just simply spit out your schedule every semester.
How did the faculty respond to that?
Laughter, and then like, oh, this is serious. I mean, it was split. It was split between a bunch of people, frankly, who have a lot more advisees than I do, who thought it would be amazing use of efficiency and save them a lot of time, and people sort of like-minded like myself who were aghast at the idea that you would pick your classes like that. So I don't know where that, the technical software is for that. I don't even know if that's, the provost came in and said it's not going to happen right away. But just that is the mentality, I think, is concerning if you're interested in the broader liberal arts.
Yeah, particularly with advising, that is definitely concerning to me. So I want to go back a little bit and sort of refocus again on sort of Tukey and the statistics that are based on this, and then thinking about some of the relationship of this to the sort of more standard way that we talk about computer history. So in particular, in chapter 9, and this is going to show my bias and what I'm interested in, you briefly discuss a clash between the ideas of Norbert Wiener and a set of his compatriots and Tukey. And you, hold on, I think I have the section, right? So you say that Tukey responded to Wiener's description of the social sciences must be enlarged, and it reduced too much of human activity to the biological or the individual. And you say this is a sort of surprising note for a statistician and mathematician to send to a writer interested in communication. And I'm wondering a little bit, because Wiener is one of my sort of figures of interest in the history of computing. I wanted to just hear more of your thoughts on him, in particular, because like he definitely had a simplified model of the world, right? He believed that everything, animals, machines, people, corporation, governments, were all based on this sort of theory of communication and control. And he describes in The Human Use of Human Beings, humans as islands of locally decreasing entropy. We are sort of figures of organized stuff that provide information in the world. But he also seems very sympathetic in many ways to a lot of the concerns that you have about bias and the way that those sort of statistical biases manifest in sort of social policies and things like that. So I was just wondering, what do you think about him? What do you think about this clash? I want to hear more.
Yeah, so it's funny when you describe him that way. I talk a lot about Herbert Spencer earlier in the book, who is kind of the 19th century version of Wiener. But I think what makes him so interesting is that he believes that you can do essentially what is reductive work in social science, but then kind of retains this this belief that his ethics could hold sway. So he's worried that all of this research is going to be co-opted by the military-industrial complex, and that all of his work is going to basically be used for ill, is his sort of big concern. And I think what Tukey is trying to say to him is, once you start reducing the subject to this level, you've already lost, and that it's too late to put up the ethical concerns, because, and you would know more than I mean, did his ethical concerns and his resistance to military co-option of his idea, did that come out of his research program, or was that just kind of his grounded ethical belief? Because I don't know how he kind of developed that level of antagonism, if it was, I've done all this research and then this is what I've concluded, or if he just kind of had this feeling.
From what I understand, it was a grounded ethical belief. So he was raised actually by a sort of humanist. In fact, I think the first professor of Slavic languages at Harvard. And he was a child prodigy that was schooled in Greek and German and Latin and all of these things from a very early age, and was reciting this poetry and had a primarily humanities education up until he ends up being forced to get a PhD in philosophy, but wandering into mathematics, and then becomes a mathematics professor at MIT. So he really had these ethical concerns from the beginning, but probably because of the education that you suggest.
Yeah. So he would fit in. I think if I dove deeper, he would fit into this story pretty well. Because that's the reason why I think Tukey's such a great figure is he has the mathematical and statistical bona fides to be in any room, in any conversation in Cold War psychology, sociology, statistics, mathematics. Ironically, a lot of the technical contributions he made were central to the internet today. I mean, Fourier first transform, he updated that, and basically the technical model by which algorithms work today is drawn from a lot of Tukey's technical work. But he never wants to. He essentially never wants to use that, and his concern kind of is almost baked into his ideas, that he simply realizes that any level of reduction, or simply once you sort of build the model, you can't just sort of turn it on and let it go. You've got to be constantly interrogating the model, and so I think that might be where he gets so concerned, is because Wiener's kind of letting things go too far.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I just wanted to highlight this quote from him that you have of the, so on page 239, when late in his career, he joined some of his Bell Lab colleagues for a presentation on thinking machines in California. He wrote on the top of his transparency, AI, yes, artificial intelligence, no, question mark. I just thought that was a lovely thing to highlight.
Yeah, he was. I won't. I guess I can keep talking about it, but it was amazing. His papers are at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and he just has files. One of his files is just labeled old machines, and he just has pictures of old computers. He's particularly interested in mechanical computers versus electronic computers. But yeah, he's constantly brought into these meetings of visionaries that he probably knows twice as much as the visionaries know, and he's skeptical of basically everything. And especially, I think this was not the peak AI when he's writing this, but I think that idea of like, yeah, AI is something, and that's kind of what we have now, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, right now we have AI, yes, of course. Artificial intelligence, no, of course not.
Yeah, absolutely. So zooming out a bit more, there's a sort of idea in this text that is implicit, although not explicit, that sort of models are just a bad idea for understanding humans. And I'm wondering, is this that models, because they are a way of reducing the world, are epistemically flawed as a way of knowing? Is there something specific about modeling humans rather than modeling other systems? What's the concern that you're getting at here?
Yeah, I mean, the concern is that it's recursive because we can analyze and read about ourselves and learn about what the model says about ourselves in a way that the planets, cannot. And we can change and modify ourselves based on what we see in the model, which makes it inherently flawed. I mean, I'm forgetting who I'm about to quote, but the idea is basically that once you find a measurement for something, it ceases to have any value. Because, and what I think about it, I'm a big baseball fan, and so the big revolution in baseball where they identified that on-base percentage was crucial to winning baseball games. And very few people, everybody looked at batting average, nobody looked at on-base percentage. But once everybody realized that on-base percentage was important, then that ceased to actually be an important model because everybody had already got those players. And so that's essentially the way it works people have argued, we were talking about Jason Blakely before, people have argued that polls, rather than sort of being a social scientific reflection of our politics, that polls themselves kind of create the division in our politics. And so that's just one kind of easy example. But yeah, the essential sense is that all scientific models of non-humans, as far as we know, don't really affect the things that they're modeling. Whereas social scientific models, we read about them, we reflect on whether we're like these models, whether we're not like these models, and we therefore act in concert with these models, which then therefore makes them unreliable because we can respond to them in ways that I don't think other models of, say, climate change models, I don't believe that the climate itself can respond in that way. The way that so, and that's throughout the book. I mean, every person who proposes a new theory of humanity based on mathematics or statistics always says, "Well, it's a little bit harder to understand people scientifically than it is to understand nature." But here's what I'm going to do anyway. And what you tend to find in most of them is that they never really get around the problem of us knowing what the models say about us, and therefore being able to act counter to them.
Yeah. And okay, so going along with that, I guess the question is, if these models are sort of like generally flawed in part because they influence us and they influence our expectations of how humans behave and all of these sorts of things, does this mean that we should not do quantitative social science research?
I mean, I wouldn't advise people to do it. I mean, I'm not going to chair a board that makes it illegal. But I would say, as a way of going about understanding the human subject, it is inherently flawed, and I have hundreds of years of evidence to prove that.
Yes, absolutely. You marshal it really nicely in this book. And then, so a lot of the sort of questions that I got from my students as well were about, like, is there any way to make a kind of AI that would be acceptable based on the kind of premises, or are you more of a sort of Luddite, not in the sense of the way that the word is used, but in the sense that Brand Merchant, who was our last speaker in this series, talked about, which is just like understanding the machinery and thinking it's a problem and targeting specifically those things that are problems.
So your question is in terms of whether sort of I mean, you probably ask this question every day in your class, whether an ethically AI is something that is possible. Mm-hmm. I've certainly not one based on current technologies of generative AI. I would have to say that. I think that, and this is kind of if you read the chapter 9 about once you start counting things, and once you again, this comes back. I don't know. I can't remember if I quoted it in the book, but I attended this conference about bias in statistics and bias in AI, and most of the people who were doing the counting and doing the statistical research kind of admitted that said, yes, of course we're going to have to discriminate as long as we are making distinctions between people and it's going into the data. It's going to be biased, and so, I think you have. I don't think a symbolic AI is really going to be around the corner, but I think it is possible to create a symbolic AI that you could program kind of neutral values into. But anything that, in terms of current generative AI, that is built upon data collection and algorithmic reasoning, I don't think could exist in a non-biased way or an ethical way. And that's mostly because, people smarter than I am who do the engineering to try to uncover these things haven't been able to do it. But I know that there are people trying to sort of use the tools of the master. I'm quoting Lord, I think. But anyway, sorry.
No, this is great. So in terms of that and following up on this, what kind of interventions can we make into the way that the world is if we know that there's no possibility for a sort of like sub-symbolically based ethical AI based on this kind of statistical data? Where do we go from here?
In terms of like what an individual person should do, or at the level of policy of
all of these things. These are all things we talk about in my class. So I'd love you to expand.
No, I think at the personal level, I think this is not an area that I come by normally, but I've been reading a little bit of Deleuze. This is probably more your world. Reading a little bit more about the situationists and these kind of random acts. And I think from a sort of a personal perspective, you can become much less kind of beholden or predictive if you kind of live more spontaneously. And the way I think about it is that AI is really good in complete boring emails. If you have a really boring task, AI is really good at it. My wife, who might still be around here, it probably is better now, but reminds me that if you have if a friend sends you a crazy dream from their dream journal and asks you what it means, AI will not necessarily give you a great answer as to what that is. If they ask what time do you want to meet next Tuesday, it's a little bit better. So I think in terms of a personal level, there's a way to kind of live, I think, more spontaneously and more and less predictably. In terms of the national sort of political level, I think regulation, I was just listening on the way in, one of the things that I think Google is now going to have to do in this antitrust settlement is Google is going to have to give up its AI as part of its search program because they just have a sort of a natural advantage because every time somebody types something into Google, and I think the EU has made much greater strides in regulating AI, and I don't think it's impossible. In terms of political will, it might be impossible, but in terms of practicality, I'm not sure why returning to something like regulation on the level of television and radio would not be possible for the internet. where you have very clear codes and responsibilities if you do anything online, in the same way that radio and television broadcasters for decades were bound by very, very strict rules about what you could do and say on the radio and TV. Whether we could pass something like that is I would hand that over to the political scientists, but certainly I would advocate for a pretty strong regulatory framework in terms of what can and what can be said, and how AIs can be allowed to operate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think actually I would love to open it up for questions, so we have plenty of time for anybody that has to go at 5:20. So, who has questions for Kevin?